Although the police powers have largely been entrusted to the states in the American constitutional system, the federal government is not entirely without authority in this realm. The Supreme Court has recognized the federal government itself has a modicum of police powers within its own domain. Congress can make laws to secure the health and welfare of the community, for example, when exercising its authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations or among states. We've traditionally assumed that the Constitution continues to apply even in the context of emergencies, and there are still limits on what government can do, even in crisis situations. We can imagine even the most extreme crises the nation has gone through, such as the Civil War. We continue to believe there were limits on government power, limits on what the government can do, limits on what government officials can do, even in those very extreme situations. Traditionally, we've seen less authority on the part of the federal government to respond to threats internally and domestically. We think of national security as being a particular kind of threat that the federal government is particularly well suited for. We tended to instead think of domestic threats of various sorts as being more particular and, as a consequence, more contained, and threats that can be bounded by constitutional rules to a much greater degree. It's the states that have the primary responsibility to protect the safety and public welfare of the community, and as a consequence, they need kinds of governmental powers that go along with that responsibility. So I don't think the president has either the constitutional or the statutory authority to issue a broad lockdown order that's equivalent to what state governors have issued in their own states. The president does not have an equivalent authority. Congress has not given the president equivalent authority to require that people shelter in place or stay in their homes, for example. Although the federal government cannot directly command state and local officials to implement federal rules in preference to state rules, it can incentivize the states to abandon their preferred policies in favor of federal policies in exchange for federal relief funds subject only to limited restrictions that such spending policies not be coercive. Congress has delegated to the executive branch some limited authority to make regulations that might be necessary to prevent the spread of disease into the United States from outside its borders or across state borders. And that arguably would give the executive branch some legal authority to impose certain kinds of restrictions on travel, for example. So it might allow the federal government to prohibit people who are infected with a dangerous disease from entering into the United States from abroad. Historically, legislatures tend to take a back seat in the midst of crises and emergencies, as Alexander Hamilton recognized famously in the Federalist Papers. One of the advantages of the executive branch, and of the president in particular, the head of the executive branch, is that it can move quickly and decisively in a way that legislatures can't. But even in the midst of a crisis or an emergency, there's still room for Congress or a legislature to take positive action. There are important steps that may be outside the scope of legal authority of an executive branch official to take that Congress alone might be able to authorize. So, for example, in the current context, the ability of making appropriations to spend relief funds to help those who are economically distressed as a consequence of the pandemic and the government response to the pandemic can only be done by the legislature.